all for coming. I know it's a Friday night. It just shows that you guys are dedicated and ready to learn here. As you may have seen, we've got pizza, wine, snacks over here. Help yourself throughout the event. It's just kind of open season. So I realize that we've got kind of a diverse crowd in here. Everyone from people who are kind of specialized in the field to people who don't know anything about it. So I'm going to start off things by just kind of explaining the very basic premise of what went on here. So here we are, and this is essentially a very basic idea of how the funding of extractive industry projects works. International finance institutions are big banks that fund extractive industry companies, which then enter into a contract with the local government in order to be allowed to extract from their land. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of tackle corruption and try to increase transparency, but the way that this research project did was focusing on these. International finance institutions, which lend money to corporations, they have certain terms on how they lend money and who they lend money to. And what the students have done is we have done research into the contracts that they enter in with these corporations to see what kind of requirements for transparency they have with local governments. The point of this is, if there's not a lot of transparency in these contracts, the money can kind of get slipped away, can go into this person's pocket, that person's pocket, and there's just no one can keep track of where it goes. It can be used to fund genocide. There's a lot of different things, environmental catastrophe, the works. So this is kind of the entire basic idea of the report. All right, so we've got a nice lineup of speakers here to teach you about this. Clients, unfortunately, couldn't get a picture for Erica. I tried to find one.
Stand up right now.
Yeah. These are the clients. They're representatives of the Revenue Watch Institute. Amir Shafai is a legal analyst for them, and Erica is the EITI policy officer. If you don't know what EITI means, you're going to learn in a minute. We also have two student presenters. Jaron Vosselstein and Georges Labroche. Jaron is actually a professional in his own right. He works at the American Jewish World Service. And Georges is also a full-time software engineer at New York Magnet. And we've got our guest speaker, Steven Donziger. He is a environmental lawyer who is currently involved in a case with Chevron, which is rather high profile, so we're lucky to have him. So thank you for coming. And we're going to kick things off with our first speaker, which is the Revenue Watch Institute.
Hi, my name is Erica Westenberg. Now you can see my face, you can see my name. So I guess first to just thank the students. We really appreciate the project, and I think the students will get into a bit more detail about the nature of their work. Amir will go into some detail too about why we passed them with what we did. But just to give you very quickly kind of an institutional background on what we do and where we're coming at these issues. Revenue Watch is a nonprofit policy institute that's focused on the transparent, accountable, and effective management of extractive resources for the public benefit. So what this means for us is, first of all, helping stakeholders with managing critical governance challenges of resource wealth. So this means the numerous pitfalls that are associated, the resource curse issues that are associated with taking what are limited, restricted resources in the ground and turning them into development, corruption issues, bribery issues, just governance challenges, helping countries and stakeholders address the myriad concerns associated with the value chain. We approach this issue with the goal of mainstreaming good governance to achieve systemic change. And what that means for us is that we are looking at global norms, things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which we'll get into later, but also working on the demand side in order for things to change in a systemic way in natural resource-rich countries. We think it's important that civil society groups, local parliamentarians, media in these countries are demanding accountability from within side. So that is the target, kind of global at the international level, but also local bottom-up demand-driven change. I think another important element of our approach on these issues to point out is that we do very frequently favor a multi-stakeholder approach. And I think it's great that in your second speaker, you're going to get to see the other side of this, a more adversarial approach on these issues. And it's certainly something that we appreciate and we know well. For if there are any students out here who are considering these issues, I think it's important to know that there are the full range of ways to interface on these issues. And we're not saying that our multi-stakeholder approaches are always a success, and there's certainly limitations of it, but often the work that we do is about bringing civil society, government, company stakeholders to the table to work on issues. Again, limitations of those, but just kind of giving you the breadth and range of approaches on extractive issues. And then the final element of this, which I already mentioned, is that our work targets the entire value chain. We actually got a question, revenue watch, does that mean you're looking specifically at the revenue collection piece? And I would say at the beginning of the organization, we really were. Since then, we have kind of developed the breadth of our expertise to try to address all of the challenges across the extractive value chain. So starting with the legal system, fiscal regime, the allocation of rights before the production is even happening, then moving along and looking at what happens, are you effectively collecting revenues? Is the government capturing all that it could? And then the other side of that, how are those revenues actually being used? So trying to look at the entire value chain in extractives is part and parcel of our approach. Right now, we're currently working in over 30 countries worldwide. We're actually have gone through a strategic review process, and will actually be identifying a smaller set of priority countries where we kind of go deep instead of going broad, but we will have limited engagement still in a range of other countries. And then to just very quickly go through some of the kind of tools for change that we use in our work. Capacity building, as I've already mentioned, is a key component. So building capacity of local stakeholders to engage on what are very technical issues in the extractives, so that when they are having conversations or litigation with companies, so that they can be equipped to know how the sector works and to engage in those discussions. So we have regional knowledge hubs that target CSOs, parliamentarians, and media, and we have a specific parliamentary training program. Technical assistance is also one of our lines of service. So in countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia, we've been involved with actually helping the government develop the oil and gas policy, and in some cases in direct contract negotiation support. In countries like Ghana, we've helped them with the development of their revenue management law. Support for monitoring and oversight bodies is another important element of our approach. So in countries like the DRC, we've helped stakeholders with contract monitoring. So even if you have good terms and obligations in a contract, you need stakeholders and oversight actors who are actually able to investigate those terms and see if the obligations outlined in those contracts are actually being adhered to. Same with budget monitoring. So on the revenue management side, are the funds from extractives being used as they should? Are they being allocated in the budget as they should? Are they going somewhere other than the budget? Targeted advocacy and outreach is a really big part of what we do, and this is where you really see a lot of what I mentioned at the beginning in terms of the global level of our work. So trying to advocate and do outreach around setting global norms that will then, again, mainstream good governance and transparency and accountability around extractives. So some of the areas where we've done this is advocacy around mandatory extractives payment disclosures, so things like Dodd-Frank and EU legislation, the broadening of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is an initiative that countries sign up to, again, originally in order to disclose revenue payments, but now in order to disclose a much broader range of information on extractives, and lobbying for that initiative to become broader to accommodate the entire value chain was a large part of our advocacy work. And then transparency policies around international financial institutions, which you'll hear more about in the later session. Applied research is also a very big component of what we do, both research that Revenue Watch does and then also helping partners, local stakeholders, to do their own policy analysis. Some of our tools in the area of applied research are the Natural Resource Charter, which we've actually just merged with, which is a framework for countries to look at different decision points in the extractive value chain, and it provides precepts and guidance on best practice that can be customized in countries that are looking to improve their extractive sector. The Resource Governance Index is an index that we do on extractive governance. It comes out every 2 years. The last report covered 58 countries, and it ranks countries on 4 overall indicators, things like transparency, the institutional framework, and gives a nice snapshot of where different countries are in terms of governance in the sector. And then the final element is thematic, issue-specific, and country-specific comparative analysis and case studies. So these are things like research on natural oil companies, a guide that we're preparing on new petroleum producers, and research on things like oil trading as well. But the one I really want to focus on, because it's the area where this student project is most directed, is around this targeted advocacy and outreach. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Amir.
So good evening, everyone. It's nice to see a lot of the students who worked on these projects here tonight. We obviously appreciate all the support that you provided to Revenue Watch and for being here on a Friday night. And to the guys who organized the event, thank you. So if that's all you remember from what we talked about tonight, remember that. We appreciate the work that you guys have done. Hopefully you got our message saying as much. So that was Revenue Watch, right? What does that have to do with what the students did for us, the client? I've never heard us referred to as the client before. It's a wonderful thing. The project started out with Tara, obviously the professor, contacting us through, we kind of are a bit in the same universe of natural resource governance. It's a slightly smaller universe, and saying there's going to be a course on the resource curse or natural resource governance issues at the new school. It's a master's level course. People are interested in learning about the issue, but they're also at a certain point in their educational and professional development that they want to do real work. So you tell us what should they do, basically. That was, if I'm not mistaken, that was the gist. We're not looking for an assignment for students just to kind of show that they can do research. We want them to do something that's going to be of assistance to organizations that are active, like Revenue Watch. And we said, okay, we've got some ideas. We started from basically what is part of our, what we call a theory of change. If any of you guys go into that kind of governance issues at all or deal with donors, they always want to know, what's your theory of change? How is it that what you're going to do is actually going to have an impact? Our theory of change, there's much more complicated models of it, but you could put it up like that as well. The idea that transparency can lead, not by itself, but is an essential part of producing greater accountability in the natural resource sector, through which you can get, hopefully, to better governance of the sector as a whole, right? And we go from there to say, okay, or we back up and you say, well, why is transparency desirable? What are you going to do with transparency? What does transparency mean, and what is the impact going to be? And for us, one of the main starting points is transparency creates better incentives. Incentives to prevent people from doing bad things and to encourage them to do better things. Our president likes to give the example of these studies that are done. So if you find $20 on the floor and there's no camera and no one's going to know, what are the chances of you putting it in your pocket versus going to the police? Do the kind of questionnaire and people give their answers. You add just a slight possibility that there might be a camera in the parking lot where you are, and you see what happens with the results. Right? All of a sudden, people are incentivized to act very differently if there's the slightest possibility that they might get caught or sued for that matter. The dynamics are actually not that different. So incentives, that's one of the main things for transparency in this sector. The other one, and I like this slide, is a level playing field. Why? Because in our sector especially, there is not a level playing field. I'm sure Mr. Donziger could tell you about that and how it's not a level playing field when you're going up against multinational companies. In many ways, governments are actually in the same dynamic, at times at least, as civil society organizations, where there's not a level playing field, and that applies to information as well. Not just wealth, but information about simple things like who knows better, and I ask this when we're dealing with governments all the time, who knows better what resource wealth is under the ground in your country? An honest government representative in most of the countries that we work with will tell you that private companies have a much better idea what's going on in our subsoil resources than we do. It applies to the terms for contracting. Who knows better what's actually a good deal, if you like, in the natural resources sector? Well, it tends to be the companies because they have the contracts, they have the information, they know how much is going to be paid to different governments in different parts of the world, and the governments don't tend to have that information. So it's the idea of producing a more level playing field, and finally, it's the opportunity for dialogue. And by that, you know, in many of the countries that we work in, especially oil-rich, mineral-rich countries, these sectors are kind of top secret, actually. This is national security type of stuff. So this is not an area where you're going to have multi-stakeholder discussions, right? Actually, in many of the countries that we work with, there aren't multi-stakeholder discussions about anything, let alone oil and gas and mining, right? By creating this push for transparency that we and a bunch of other organizations, or whatever you want to call it, have created, you at least, if nothing else, bring this issue to the table, right? Whereas it wasn't before in many places. It still continues not to be in many places. Anyway, so that was the short version. Assume you're convinced that transparency is a good thing and can lead to better governance. We can have a more in-depth discussion. But to get to the point of, okay, what did we ask the students to do? What did we ask you to do? Let's just assume transparency is good, okay? Transparency of what? There's a lot of things happening in the sector. So we could be talking about a whole bunch of things. We didn't want the students to be doing a report for us about the whole sector and what sort of issues are going to be involved. Our organization is one of the very few organizations in the world that's pretty much completely dedicated to natural resource governance issues. Right? We didn't want a general report. We wanted to push forward our advocacy agenda, as Eric was mentioning. Our advocacy agenda right now, amongst other things, includes pushing forward transparency of payments. What payments? Payments by companies to governments. Why? As the introduction to the whole session was mentioning, it can be a way of having greater control on how that money is spent. A lot of times local communities, like real local communities, not at the national level, have a right to a certain percentage of those payments, either by contract or by law. So knowing how much is paid is very relevant to them. There's a bunch of different reasons, including figuring out whether it was a good deal or not, why payments are important. So we want to push for greater transparency of the payments by companies to governments. The second thing we were focused on are contracts. Contracts, why? Because actually the contracts that these guys enter into with governments are one of the main vehicles by which the value is determined. Unfortunately,